The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, folded into thirds and sealed with plain wax, bearing no ornamentation whatsoever, and Clayton Kendrick nearly threw it into the wood stove without reading it because he figured it was another bill from the feed merchant in Abilene. He was glad he did not. He was standing at the kitchen table of his ranch house outside of Dusty Creek, Kansas, a wide open stretch of prairie land that rolled out in every direction like a golden quilt sewn by God himself, and the late afternoon light was coming through the single window above the dry sink, cutting a warm band of amber across the rough-hewn floorboards. He had just come in from mending fence on the north pasture, his hands still raw from the wire, his boots still carrying the honest weight of red Kansas dirt, and he smelled like horse and wind and hard work. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the deep brown of river water in October. He lived alone. He had lived alone for 3 years now, since his father passed and left him the ranch and 140 acres of sky. He broke the wax seal with his thumb, unfolded the paper, and read. The handwriting was careful. Not ornate, not showy in the least, but careful, as if each letter had been placed with deliberate intention, as if the person writing had wanted to be precise above all else. The ink was dark, the paper slightly rough, the kind a person bought from a dry goods store rather than a stationer's shop. It began, "Dear Mr. Kendrick, I am writing in response to the advertisement placed in the Dodge City Register for a wife and helpmate. I want to be honest with you from the very first word because I think honesty is the only fair foundation for any arrangement of this kind." He pulled out the single chair at the table and sat down. "I am 24 years of age," she had written. "I am in good health, though I am not particularly strong. I was raised on a farm outside of Hays City, Kansas, so I am not ignorant of the kind of work that ranch life requires. I can cook well enough that a man will not go hungry, though I make no claim to being a fine cook. I can sew, manage a household, and keep accounts if needed, as I was fortunate enough to receive some schooling. I am not a woman of great beauty. I am not remarkable in any especial way. I have brown hair and brown eyes, and a face that is entirely ordinary. I am telling you this not out of false modesty, but because I think a man deserves to know the truth of what he would be getting before any agreement is made. I will not pretend to be something I am not in order to secure a situation. If these plain facts do not suit your needs, I understand entirely and I wish you well in your search. If, however, you are a man who values honesty and plain dealing over pretty words, I would be glad to correspond further." She had signed it, "Sincerely, Miss Edna Hadley." Clayton read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and looked out the window at the prairie, where the tall grass was bending sideways in the late afternoon wind, and he thought about what it said. He had received 4 other letters in response to the advertisement he had placed, all of them from women who had described themselves in terms so glowing he had been half suspicious they had made themselves up entirely. One had claimed to be a gifted musician and an expert horsewoman and an accomplished seamstress who also happened to be considered a great beauty in her county. He had read that letter and folded it back up and set it aside and felt nothing much at all. This one was different. He read it a third time, and something in the directness of it struck him in a way he could not immediately name. There was something almost painful about the honesty. She had written that she was unremarkable in every way, and she had written it plainly, without apology, without self-pity, just as simple fact. And for some reason he could not explain, that sentence lodged itself in his chest like a splinter of wood, small and sharp, and impossible to ignore. He went to the small desk in the corner where he kept the ranch ledger and the few letters he had received over the years, and he found a clean sheet of paper and a good pen, and he sat down and wrote back that same evening. "Dear Miss Hadley," he wrote, "thank you for your letter. I found it the most honest piece of writing I have received in some time, and I mean that as a sincere compliment. I am not a man who prizes ornamentation, either in his surroundings or in his correspondence. I'm a rancher, as the advertisement stated. I run cattle and I mend my own fence and I cook my own meals, which are nothing to speak highly of, so it would be an improvement on the current situation to have someone share that duty with me. I am not a wealthy man, but I am a solvent one. I have a sturdy house that wants a woman's attention but is not beyond saving. I am not a complicated man, though I have my faults as all men do. I am 28 years old. I am told I am not unpleasant to look at, though I will let you be the judge of that. I would very much like to correspond further if you are willing. Please write again at your convenience. He signed it, yours sincerely, Clayton Kendrick. He folded it, sealed it, and rode into Dusty Creek the next morning to post it before he could change his mind or overthink it, which was a tendency he had always had to fight. Her reply came 11 days later. He had been watching for the mail rider with slightly more attention than he would have liked to admit. When the envelope arrived and he recognized the careful handwriting, he felt something shift in his chest, a small but definite movement, like a gear falling into place that had been slightly off its track. She had written 3 pages this time. She told him about growing up on the Hadley farm, about her father who had died 2 winters ago from a fever that had swept through the county, leaving her and her mother alone. Her mother had remarried the previous autumn, a decent widower from outside of Hayes City named Gerald Pratt, who was good to her mother but who had made it clear, not unkindly but very clearly, that the house was going to be crowded with his own 2 grown sons moving back in, and that Edna might find it suitable to make her own arrangements going forward. She had written this without apparent bitterness, only with the same plain honesty of her first letter. I understand his position, she had written. It is his house, and I have no claim on it. But it has made the question of my own situation more pressing than I might have otherwise addressed it. She told him she had taught school for 1 year in the small schoolhouse outside Hayes City, but that the school board had dismissed her when the enrollment dropped too low to justify the expense. She told him she liked to read, that she had a small collection of books she was rather attached to, and hoped he would not mind their presence in the house. She told him she was not afraid of hard work, that she had never been afraid of it, but she was honest enough to say that she preferred the kind of hard work that left her with something to show for it at the end of the day, something ordered or clean or fed, rather than the kind that simply ground a person down without purpose. I realize I am telling you a great deal about myself for a second letter, she had written near the end. I hope it does not seem too forward. I am told that I have a tendency to say too much when I am trying to be clear, and that I should cultivate more mystery. I have never been very good at mystery, I am afraid. Clayton laughed out loud when he read that, alone in his kitchen, and the sound surprised him because he had not laughed like that in some time. He wrote back that same evening again. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle operation, about the quarter-horse breeding he was trying to develop because he believed there was good money in quality horses if a man was patient enough about it. He told her about Dusty Creek, which was a small town, honest and plain, with a post office and a general store and a saloon and a church and a schoolhouse that, as it happened, was currently without a teacher. He told her about the land, and he found himself writing about it in a way he had never spoken of it aloud, about how in the evenings the light on the prairie turned the grass to something that looked almost like copper, and how on clear nights the stars were so numerous and so close that a man felt both very small and very much a part of something enormous at the same time. He almost cut that last part out. He left it in. Her reply, when it came, said, "I would like to see those stars." After that, the letters came faster, every week or sometimes twice a week, and the correspondence took on a rhythm that Clayton found he had built his days around without quite noticing it was happening. He would work through the morning, through the heat of the afternoon, and then in the evening he would sit at his desk and write to Edna Hadley in Hayes City, telling her about the day, about the horse that had thrown a shoe on the rocky ground near the creek, about the argument he had witnessed between the blacksmith and the dry goods merchant on the main street of Dusty Creek over a disputed bill, about the way the creek ran high and brown after the spring rains. And she would write back about her days, about helping her mother in the house before the Pratt sons arrived, and made that help unwelcome, about the books she was reading, about the neighbor woman who kept inviting her to a sewing circle that Edna found alternately pleasant and stifling depending on the day. She wrote about small things with a precision that he found remarkable, the way she described the quality of light on the Kansas plain in the early morning, the way she wrote about the smell of bread baking as something almost spiritual, the way she could take a single ordinary moment and lay it out in words so that he could see it perfectly, as if he had been standing there beside her. He did not think there was anything unremarkable about her at all. He was 3 months into the correspondence, and had read every one of her letters so many times that the first one was beginning to wear at the folds from being opened and refolded. He kept them in the desk drawer, but the first one he sometimes carried to the field with him, folded inside his breast pocket, which he knew was a foolish thing to do and did not stop doing. It was his neighbor, a gruff and good-hearted rancher named Hank Gruber, who ran cattle on the land to the east, who finally said what Clayton had been turning over in his mind for weeks. They were sitting on the front porch of Clayton's house one evening after discussing a shared fence line, and Hank had a cup of coffee balanced on his knee, and he looked at Clayton and said, "You going to send for that woman, or are you going to spend the rest of your natural life writing to her?" Clayton looked out at the darkening prairie and said, "I'm thinking on it." Hank made a sound that expressed a low opinion of this answer. "Thinking on it," Hank repeated. "Son, you talk about this woman every other sentence you say. You've been writing to her for 3 months. Either she's not worth sending for, or you are being a fool about it." "I don't know that we'd suit in person," Clayton said, though even as he said it he knew it was not his real hesitation. His real hesitation was harder to name. He was afraid, though he would not have put it in those words exactly. He had been alone for 3 years and had built something of a fortress out of that aloneness, something orderly and self-sufficient, and the prospect of dismantling it terrified him in a way that had nothing to do with Edna Hadley specifically and everything to do with his own particular nature. "You know what I think," Hank said. "No," Clayton said. "I think you're scared she'll like the letters better than the man." Clayton did not say anything to that for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a very perceptive thing for you to say, Hank." "I have my moments," Hank said, and drank his coffee. Clayton wrote to Edna that night and asked her if she would consider coming to Dusty Creek with a view toward meeting in person, and if they found they suited each other, making a more permanent arrangement. He was careful to say that he understood if she preferred not to, and that there was no obligation, and that he wanted her to feel entirely free in her decision. He sealed the letter, and then he sat at his desk for a long time after, looking at the single lamp flame and listening to the prairie wind outside. She wrote back within the week. Yes, she said. She would come. He had arranged for her to stay with the pastor's wife, a capable and kind woman named Mrs. Alois Farber, so that propriety would be preserved and she would have somewhere to stay that felt safe and not obligating to either of them. He had written and explained this carefully, and she had written back saying she appreciated his thoughtfulness and that it spoke well of his character. He drove the wagon into Dusty Creek on the morning of June the 9th, 1882, and tied up outside the train depot, which was really just a small platform and a ticket window alongside the rail line that cut through the south edge of town. He was wearing his good shirt, and he had shaved that morning, which he did not always bother to do on working days. He stood beside the wagon and watched the eastbound train come in on a long tail of white steam that spread out over the yellow grass like something celestial. He did not know what she looked like. He had not asked her to describe herself beyond the brief note in that first letter, and in all their subsequent correspondence neither of them had pressed for a physical description. He had her first letter in his pocket, worn soft as cloth now from the months of handling, and he was aware of it like a warm coal against his ribs. 3 passengers stepped off the train. A man in a business suit carrying a leather case, an older woman with a large hat, and a young woman who stepped off the platform steps with a small traveling bag in one hand and a stack of books tied with string in the other, and she stood on the depot platform and looked around with the kind of clear, attentive gaze of a person who misses very little. He knew it was her immediately. He could not have said how he knew, except that there was something in the directness of how she looked at the world that matched the directness of her letters perfectly. And he had been reading those letters long enough now that he had formed an impression of her, not of her face or her figure, but of something more essential than either of those things, and it was that essential thing he recognized. She was, as she had described herself, brown-haired and brown-eyed, and not a woman who would stop traffic on a city street. She was medium in height, slight in build, wearing a sensible dark blue traveling dress that showed the dust of the journey. Her face was, as she had written, entirely ordinary at first glance, the kind of face that did not demand immediate attention. But then she saw him coming toward her, and she tilted her head slightly, just a fraction, and something moved across her face that was equal parts nervous and curious and quietly determined, and he thought, "She is not ordinary in the least." "Miss Hadley," he said, stopping a polite distance away and lifting his hat. "Mr. Kendrick," she said. Her voice was even and clear and somewhat lower than he had expected, and it suited her. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes for a moment, and then she said, "You are not unpleasant to look at." Your letter was accurate on that point. He was so surprised by this that he laughed, a full, honest laugh, and her expression broke into something warmer, a smile that changed her face entirely, not from ordinary into beautiful in any conventional sense, but from closed into open, and that was better. "May I carry those books?" he asked. "They are rather heavy," she said, and handed them over. He led her to the wagon, helped her up, and drove through Dusty Creek toward the pastor's house, pointing out the general store and the post office and the schoolhouse along the way, and she asked questions about each of them that were not the questions he expected. She did not ask about the social life of the town or about the church or the women's circles. She asked about the school enrollment, about whether the post office got regular mail service, about what the general store stocked for dry goods. Practical questions, honest questions. She stayed with Mrs. Farber, and he came to call on her that evening, and they sat on the pastor's porch in the long June light and talked for 3 hours as easily as people who had known each other for years, which in some important sense they had. He showed her the ranch the following morning. He watched her face as the wagon came over the low rise and the land spread out before them, the house and the barn and the corrals and the long rolling sweep of the prairie in every direction, and she went very still and quiet for a moment. "Those stars you wrote about," she said, looking out at the open sky. "They come out every clear night," he said. "I would like to stay," she said, and then turned quickly to look at him. "I mean, I would like to see the ranch. I was not making a declaration." "I understood what you meant," he said. He showed her the house, and she walked through it with that same attentive gaze, looking at the walls and the floor and the window that let in the afternoon light, and she touched the rough wood of the kitchen table and looked at the cast iron stove and the dry sink, and when she turned around her expression was honest. "It needs work," she said. "I know it," he said. "But it is a good house," she said. "You can feel that. Some houses have good bones and some do not. This one does." He had never thought of his house in those terms before, and he found the description so accurate and so unexpected that it stopped him for a moment. She asked to see the horses, and he showed her the quarter horses he was developing, and she stood at the fence and watched them move with a quiet attention that told him she had grown up around horses and knew what she was looking at. "The bay mare," she said, pointing. "She's the best one." She was right. The bay mare was the best one. He took her back to town in the late afternoon, and he asked her to dinner at the only restaurant in Dusty Creek, which was a small establishment run by a Mexican woman named Dolores Reyes, who served beef and beans and fresh cornbread and strong coffee and minded her own business, which Clayton had always appreciated. They sat across from each other in the warm lamplight of Dollar's restaurant, and Edna Hadley folded her hands on the table and looked at him and said, "I think I should tell you something." "All right," he said. "I have been very matter-of-fact in these conversations, and I want to continue to be so, because I think it is the only honest way to proceed," she said. "I like you considerably. I liked your letters very much, and I find that I like you in person at least as much, which is not always the case in these kinds of arrangements. I think the ranch is a beautiful place, even though the house needs considerable attention. And I think I could be happy here, though I want to be careful about saying that too quickly because I am aware that 2 days is not long enough to know anything for certain." He looked at her for a moment. The lamp flame moved between them, casting warm shadows. "I like you considerably too," he said. "I have liked you since that first letter." "That first letter was nothing but a list of my own deficiencies," she said. "It was the most honest piece of writing I had received in years," he said. "I told you that." She looked at the tablecloth for a moment and then back up at him, and he saw that he had said something that landed somewhere important in her. "I think," she said carefully, "that people have been telling me for a long time that honesty is not a particularly becoming quality in a woman." "Then they were wrong," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, I believe they were." He asked her to marry him 3 days later. They were standing at the fence watching the horses again, which had become a habit already, a quiet daily ritual of standing at the fence in the evening light, and he had been thinking about how to say it and in the end decided the only right way was plainly. "Edna," he said, "I would like you to marry me. Not because it is the next logical step in this arrangement, but because I want to. I have wanted to since I read that first letter, though I did not understand then what it was I was feeling. I understand it now." She was quiet for a long moment. The mare moved across the corral with her easy, powerful stride. "You read that letter a great many times," she said. "It was not quite a question." "The paper is nearly worn through at the folds," he said honestly. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, in that direct way she had that left nowhere to hide, and he let her look because he had nothing to hide. "I will marry you, Clayton Kendrick," she said, "on one condition." "Name it," he said. "I want it to be a real marriage," she said, "not an arrangement. Not a practical solution. I have had enough of practical solutions to last me a considerable while. If I am going to marry you, I want us to try, honestly, to make something real." "That is exactly what I want," he said. "Then yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there at the fence while the mare moved in the golden light and the prairie stretched away in every direction, and neither of them said anything for a while because it did not seem necessary. They were married by Pastor Farber on the 20th of June, 1882, in the small white church at the edge of Dusty Creek. The congregation was sparse, as they had not been in the town long enough to accumulate a great crowd of well-wishers, but Hank Gruber was there in his good suit looking more uncomfortable than Clayton had ever seen him, and Dollar's Rays had baked a cake and brought it to the church without being asked, and Mrs. Farber was there with her handkerchief ready, and 3 or 4 of the townspeople who had heard about it came out of simple neighborly interest. Edna wore a dress of deep rose-colored fabric that she had sewn herself in the 2 weeks between accepting his proposal and the wedding day, and it was not a fancy dress, but it was beautifully made, every seam precise and even, and she wore her brown hair pinned up with 2 small pearl-tipped pins that had belonged to her mother, and she walked to the altar with the same direct, quiet composure she brought to everything, and Clayton thought she was the loveliest thing he had ever seen in his life. He said so later, when they were alone. She looked at him for a moment with that expression she sometimes had when he said something that surprised her. "I told you I was not a woman of great beauty," she said. "You told me you were unremarkable in every way," he said. "I have been meaning to discuss that sentence with you for several months. And what is your opinion of it? that it is the single most incorrect statement in an otherwise admirably accurate correspondence," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Clayton, yes, I am very glad I wrote that letter." "So am I," he said, "every day." The early months of their marriage were a discovery, the particular and daily discovery of learning another person not from letters but from life, from proximity, from the thousand small ways a person is themselves in an ordinary day. Clayton learned that Edna woke before him every morning by a full half hour and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and a book before she began the day's work, and that this quiet time was important to her in a way she could not entirely articulate, but that he came to understand was as essential to her as water. He made a point of not interrupting it. He would come down the stairs and find her there, the lamp still lit against the early dark, a cup in one hand and a book in the other, her hair loose around her shoulders, and he would make his own coffee quietly and go out to the barn and let her have that hour. And every time he did it, she would look up when he came back and later, and there would be something warm in her eyes that told him he had given her something real. He learned that she was far more capable than she had described herself. The house, under her attention, underwent a transformation that was not dramatic but was thorough. She did not tear anything down or change anything fundamental. She cleaned and repaired and arranged and hung curtains she made from good cotton bought at the general store, and she established a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house and planted things with purpose, not just vegetables for the table but a border of marigolds because she liked the color. He found the marigolds important in a way he did not expect. They were the first unnecessary thing about the ranch, the first thing there for no reason but beauty, and they changed something about the whole place. She learned, in turn, the particular terrain of him. She learned that he was not a man who spoke easily about things that troubled him, that his silences were not absence but processing, that he needed to be given room to arrive at whatever he needed to say, and that if she waited without pressure, he would arrive at it eventually. She learned that he was quietly generous in ways he would not have called generosity, the way he always made sure her coffee cup was full when he was filling his own, the way he noticed when she was tired before she said so, the way he fixed the hinge on her trunk without her asking, because he had noticed it was difficult to open. She learned that he was lonely. Not in a desperate way, not in a way he wore on the surface, but in the deep way of a man who had spent too many years alone on a wide, empty plain, a loneliness that had become so familiar he had stopped noticing it, the way a person stops noticing the sound of wind after a while. And she found that she could ease that loneliness simply by being present, by talking to him across the supper table, by reading aloud sometimes in the evenings from one of her books, by reaching for his hand when they stood at the fence watching the horses in the evening light. The trouble began in August. It came in the form of a man named Virgil Combs, who rode onto the ranch one afternoon while Clayton was in the north pasture and Edna was in the kitchen garden. He came on a yellow horse with a tied-down gun and the kind of easy, watchful look of a man who made his living in ways that were not easily listed in polite company. Edna straightened up from the marigolds and looked at him with her direct gaze and said, "Can I help you?" Combs looked down at her from horseback with an assessing look that she did not like. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, weathered and hard-faced, with pale eyes that moved around the property as he spoke to her. "I am looking for Clayton Kendrick," he said. "He is working," Edna said. "I am his wife. If you have business with him, you can state it to me and I will pass it along." Combs smiled at that in a way that did not reach his eyes. "No offense, ma'am, it's man's business." "Then you can wait," Edna said pleasantly, "or you can ride out and come back when he is in and I will tell him you called." "I will wait," Combs said. He dismounted and stood with his horse near the fence without being invited to do so, and Edna went inside and left the kitchen door open where she could see him, and got her husband's rifle from its place behind the door, and set it on the kitchen table within easy reach. And then she started making bread because the dough had been waiting long enough. When Clayton came in 2 hours later and saw Combs at the fence, he went still in a way that told Edna immediately that he knew this man, and that the knowing was not a good thing. She watched from the kitchen window as Clayton walked to the fence and stood there talking to Combs for 10 minutes, and she watched Clayton's face, which was controlled and flat in the way it got when something was requiring all of his restraint. Then Combs remounted and rode out, and Clayton came inside. He sat down at the kitchen table. He was dusty and tired from the afternoon work, and the conversation had clearly cost him something. "His name is Virgil Combs," Clayton said. "He used to work for my father before I took over the ranch." "What kind of work?" Edna asked. Clayton was quiet for a moment. "The kind that my father should not have involved himself in," he said. "There was a period before I was old enough to have any say in it where my father let certain men use this ranch as a way station for cattle that had come from places they should not have come from." Edna nodded slowly, understanding him. "Your father is gone," she said. "What does Combs want with you?" "He wants the use of the property again," Clayton said. "Just for a few nights, he says, just to move some stock through." "Stolen cattle," Edna said. "That is what I understood him to mean, yes," Clayton said. "And you told him no," Edna said. "I told him no," Clayton said. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. "Do you think he will accept that answer?" "I do not know," Clayton said. He was looking at the coffee cup with an expression she had come to recognize as the look he wore when he was carrying something heavy and had not yet figured out how to set it down. "We should tell the sheriff," she said. "Harlan Briggs," Clayton said, and there was a complicated quality to his voice when he said the name. "Is he a good man?" Edna asked. "He is a careful man," Clayton said. "And Combs has friends in town." Edna was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. Outside, the summer light was long and golden, and the marigolds were bright along the south wall, and the prairie stretched away in its beautiful indifference. "Tell me what you are afraid of," she said quietly. "Not the practical things, what you are actually afraid of." He looked at her across the table. Then he said, "I am afraid of what it will mean for the ranch if any of my father's old business comes to light. This land is what I have. It is what I have built and what I intend to leave behind, something worth leaving. If Combs starts making noise about what went on here before I took over, or if someone decided I was involved in it, were you?" Edna asked directly. "No," he said with equal directness. "I was 17 when the worst of it happened. I argued with my father about it. We did not speak for almost a year." "Then you have nothing to hide," she said. "And Combs has everything to lose if he starts making accusations, because it would draw attention he does not want." Clayton looked at her for a long moment. "You are very clear-headed about things that would have other people frightened," he said. "I am frightened," she said honestly. "But I find that being clear-headed and frightened are not mutually exclusive." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and they sat like that for a while. The next morning, they rode to town together and spoke to Sheriff Briggs, who was a compact, deliberate man of about 50 with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of human nature to have few illusions left about it. He listened to Clayton's account without interruption, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he appreciated being told, and that he would have a conversation with Combs if and when Combs showed up in his jurisdiction. "You did the right thing, Kendrick," Briggs said. He glanced at Edna. "Your wife is right. Combs has a warrant outstanding in 2 other counties. He cannot afford to press this very hard." "I did not know about the warrant," Clayton said. "I suspected something of the kind," Edna said. Briggs looked at her with something that might have been respect. "What led you to that conclusion?" "A man that brazen in his approach is either someone who has a great deal of protection or someone who has nothing left to lose and is making a show of confidence," she said. "He did not strike me as a man who had a great deal of protection. There was desperation underneath the swagger." Briggs nodded slowly. "Mrs. Kendrick, has anyone ever told you that you have a considerable talent for reading people?" "No one has, actually," she said. "Well," Briggs said, "they should have." Combs came back once more, a week later in the evening, And this time Clayton was at the ranch and met him at the gate with the Remington in his hands, and the kind of quiet certainty in his voice, and his stance that communicated very clearly that this conversation was over. Combs read the situation correctly and rode out and did not come back. They heard later, from Hank Gruber, who heard it from the male rider who knew a deputy in the next county, that Combs had been arrested the following month in Hutchinson for cattle theft and was awaiting trial. Edna heard this news and nodded once with the expression of someone whose calculation has proven correct, and Clayton watched her and felt something that was not quite pride but was very close to it, and was also something warmer and deeper than pride. The summer passed into autumn. The season changed slowly on the Kansas plain, the grass going from gold to brown, the air sharpening at the edges, the sky dropping lower and more vivid. Edna's kitchen garden was finished for the year, the last of the squash harvested and stored in the cellar, and she was talking about what she would put in next spring with the focus of someone planning a campaign. In October, Clayton finished the new section of the south barn he had been building since before Edna arrived, and she came out to look at it in the late afternoon and ran her hands over the new wood with the same attention she gave to anything she assessed. "It's well done," she said. "I had help," he said. "Hank sent over 2 of his boys for the framing. You should have them for dinner," she said, "to say thank you properly." "I was going to pay them," he said. "Pay them and have them for dinner," she said. "Those are not the same thing." So they had Hank and his 2 sons, boys of about 16 and 18 named Carl and Robert, to dinner on a Sunday in October, and Edna cooked a meal that silenced the table in the best possible way. A beef roast with root vegetables and fresh bread and a dried apple pie, and Hank ate 3 pieces of pie, and declared that Clayton Kendrick was the luckiest man in the state of Kansas. And Clayton looked across the table at his wife, and said that he was well aware of that fact. And Edna looked at her plate with the small smile she had, when something pleased her that she was not going to make a fuss about. After supper, Hank and Clayton sat on the porch with their pipes while Edna and Robert washed up inside, and Carl sat on the porch steps reading one of Edna's books, which she had pressed on him when she discovered he liked to read, and Hank said quietly, "She's good for you." "I know it," Clayton said. "More than good," Hank said. "I have known you since you were 22 years old, and I have never seen you easy in yourself the way you are now. Something settled in you, son." Clayton looked out at the autumn night, the prairie silver dark under a 3/4 moon, the air cold and clean. "She does that," he said. "She makes things clear." "How?" Hank asked. "I don't know exactly," Clayton said. "She just tells the truth about things, about herself, about me, about what she sees, and somehow that makes everything around her clearer." Hank puffed his pipe thoughtfully. "That is either the most sensible thing you have ever said or the most romantic. I cannot decide which." "Maybe both," Clayton said. In November, Edna received a letter from her mother. She read it at the kitchen table in the morning in her usual quiet hour, and when Clayton came in from the barn he found her still at the table with the letter in her hands and a complicated expression on her face. "News from home?" he asked carefully. "From my mother," she said. "She is well. The Pratt household is settled." She paused. "She says she is glad I found a good situation." She said the word situation in a tone that contained multitudes, and Clayton sat down across from her. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "That she sees it as a situation?" Edna set the letter down and looked at him. "She is happy for me," she said, "in her way. She simply has a different way of understanding things than I do." "What is her way?" "She understands a woman's life as a series of situations that must be navigated," Edna said. "Practical ones. One finds the best available situation and one makes the best of it. That is not a cynical view exactly. It is an honest one in her experience." "And your experience?" Clayton asked. Edna looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the November wind was pulling at the bare branches of the single cottonwood tree that grew near the east corner of the house. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have something considerably better than a situation." He reached across the table and she took his hand. "I am going to write her back," Edna said, "and tell her that." "Tell her I said hello," he said. Edna smiled at that. I will." She wrote back to her mother that afternoon, and Clayton did not read the letter because it was not his to read, but she left it on the table unsealed while she went to get the envelope, and he caught a single sentence at the bottom of the page, not deliberately, but because his eyes fell on it as he passed. He read my first letter until the paper wore thin. I think that is the best thing anyone has ever done for me. He walked past and went out to the yard and stood in the cold November air for a while. Winter came down hard on the Kansas plain that year. The first real snow fell in late November, and by December the prairie was buried under a white expanse that had its own severe beauty. The grass and the fence posts and the bare trees all encased in white under a sky the color of old pewter. Clayton kept the fires going, and Edna kept the house warm and the larder full, and they were snowed in for 3 days in the middle of December, and found, to neither of their surprise, that they were good company for the confinement. She read to him in the evenings from a novel she had been working through, a thick book that kept them occupied for a week's worth of evenings, and he found that he liked being read to enormously, liked the sound of her voice in the warm lamplight, liked the way she sometimes stopped to comment on a passage, and they would fall into a conversation that ranged far from the book itself and ended up somewhere unexpected and interesting. He taught her to play cards, which she had never learned, and she proved to have a very good memory and a nearly unreadable expression when she chose to deploy it, and within 2 weeks she was beating him consistently at whist, which amused them both considerably. In January, Edna told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, in her quiet hour, looking up from her coffee with the direct gaze and the careful expression of someone delivering important news, that they are not sure how it will be received. He did not say anything for a moment because the feeling that moved through him was large enough that it required a moment to accommodate. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him. "I am very much better than all right," he said. She nodded, and something relaxed in her expression, something she had been holding ready in case the news had needed managing. "Are you?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and it was simple and certain. "I am glad. I wanted to tell you before I was sure, but I wanted to be sure before I told you, and I am now certain." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his rough hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth. And she reached up and held his wrists, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the cold January morning. "I am going to put another room on the south side of the house," he said, when he finally pulled back. "That can wait until spring," she said. "I know it can wait," he said. "I am just telling you what I am going to do," she laughed. The pregnancy was healthy and unremarkable in the best sense of that word, which Edna would probably have pointed out herself if anyone had used the word in her presence. She continued with all of her work, reduced only by necessity, and when the spring came she put in her kitchen garden again with some additions, having spent the winter with a seed catalog she had ordered from a supplier in Missouri, planning things with the same careful thoroughness she brought to everything. In April, Dolores Reyes came out to the ranch and sat with Edna at the kitchen table and told her things about what to expect that Edna's mother had not covered in her letters, practical things and kind things. And the two women established a friendship that afternoon that was grounded in Dolores' complete lack of condescension and Edna's complete appreciation of the same. Dolores had been in Dusty Creek for 7 years. She had come with her husband, who had died of a heart ailment 4 years back, and she had kept the restaurant open herself and run it better than it had been run before. And she had a quality that Edna recognized and admired, the quality of a person who has decided who they are and has no particular interest in anyone else's opinion about it. "You are going to be fine," Dolores told Edna that April afternoon, drinking her coffee at the kitchen table. "You are one of the sensible ones. The women who have the hardest time are the ones who are frightened and too proud to say so. You are not like that." "I am frightened," Edna said honestly. "But you said so," Dolores said. "That is the difference." Edna considered this. "Saying it aloud does seem to reduce it somewhat," she said. Everything true does, Dollar said. Clayton built the new room onto the south side of the house in May, when the weather was warm enough to work from early morning to evening, and Hank Gruber sent his sons over again, and the three of them framed it up in a long weekend, and Edna sat on the porch with lemonade she had made and watched with the specific satisfaction of someone watching a good plan become a real thing. "You designed the window wrong," she said on the second day. Clayton stopped and looked at her. "The window," she said. "It should face southeast, not south. Southeast in this country means morning light. A child should have morning light in their room." He looked at the half-framed window and then at the angle of the morning light across the house, and then he said, "You're right," and they moved it. Hank's older boy Carl, who was now 19, and had taken to coming by the ranch with some regularity for reasons that had more to do with Edna's cooking and her library than any particular task that needed doing, watched this exchange and said very quietly to Hank, "She is something else." Hank said, "She is, son." Their child was born in September of 1883, a boy, arrived on an early September morning with the summer heat still thick in the air and Dollar's rays present, and in command of the situation with the calm authority of someone who has done this before. Clayton had been sent to the front porch and had spent an hour there in the early light, unable to do anything useful, which was one of the worst feelings he had ever experienced. When Dolars opened the door and told him he could come in, he found Edna sitting up in the bed with a great deal of composure for someone who had just accomplished what she had accomplished, and she was holding a wrapped bundle of what appeared to be baby, and she looked up at him when he came through the door with her direct brown eyes and said, "Come meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, and he looked down at the face of his son, which was red and crumpled and entirely extraordinary. "What do you want to call him?" he asked, his voice not entirely steady. Edna thought for a moment. "I like the name James," she said, "after no one in particular. Just because I think it is a good name." "James Kendrick," Clayton said, trying it. The baby made a small protesting sound, as if weighing in on the matter. "He agrees," Edna said. Clayton looked up from his son to his wife, and she looked back at him, and the morning light was coming through the southeast window exactly as she had planned it would. The years moved forward the way good years do, with the particular quality of time that is both passing and accumulating, each day adding to something rather than simply being spent. James was a bright and lively child who walked early and talked early and had his mother's directness and his father's capacity for silence, which was an unusual combination that made him interesting company from the time he was very small. He followed Edna through the kitchen garden with total absorption from the time he could walk, and he followed Clayton to the barn with equal absorption. And by the time he was 3, he had formed definite opinions about horses that were not always wrong. The horse breeding operation had developed well by 1884 and 1885. Clayton had established a reputation for quality quarter horses that had spread enough to bring buyers from as far as Wichita, and the bay mare that Edna had correctly identified as his best animal had produced 2 foals that had done well at selling and would do better still when they were worked up. The ranch was prospering in a modest and solid way, the kind of prospering that comes from consistent good work rather than luck or speculation. Edna had applied for and received the position of teacher at the Dusty Creek Schoolhouse in the autumn of 1884, when James was a year old, and she was ready to do something beyond the house, and she had rearranged the household around it with her usual organizational competence. Mrs. Farber, who was fond of James and had a gift with small children, came to the house on the days Edna taught, and Clayton arranged his own schedule to be at the house by early afternoon. She taught 12 students that first year, ranging from age 6 to 14, and she brought to the schoolhouse the same qualities she brought to everything: directness, honesty, a complete absence of condescension, and an expectation of effort that her students largely rose to meet because she expected it of them so plainly. Carl Gruber, Hank's older boy, came to her at the end of that first year and said he wanted to know how to get more schooling than Dusty Creek could provide, that he wanted to study law eventually, and he did not know where to start. Edna sat with him for an hour and outlined a course of self-study, gave him 3 books from her own collection, and wrote a letter to a school in Wichita on his behalf. She told Clayton about it over supper that evening, and he said he was not surprised, and she said why not, and he said because from the first day he had brought her to the ranch, Carl Gruber had looked at her the way people look at the person who is going to open a door for them that they did not know existed. Edna was quiet for a moment, and then she said that was a very perceptive thing for him to say. "I have my moments," he said, deliberately echoing Hank, and she laughed. In 1886, Edna wrote to her mother asking if she would like to come visit. The question had been a long time coming. Her relationship with her mother was not difficult exactly, but it was careful in the way relationships are careful when 2 people love each other but have very different ways of understanding the world, and the distance had made it easier to maintain a comfortable warmth by letter than it might have been in close proximity. Her mother came in June, traveling alone, arriving at the Dusty Creek depot with more luggage than Edna had brought when she had arrived 4 years earlier. She was a small, neat woman in her 50s with Edna's brown eyes and a manner that was simultaneously warm and brisk, and she stepped off the train and looked at her daughter and then at Clayton standing beside her and then at James on his mother's hip, and something softened in her face. "Well," she said, looking at the 3 of them. "Well." Her mother's name was Alice Hadley, still Hadley despite the remarriage, because she had decided to keep the name. She stayed for 3 weeks, and the visit was layered and complicated and ultimately good in the way things are good when they require work to get there. Alice was a woman formed entirely by the practical school of thought about women's lives, and she had spent Edna's girlhood trying to prepare her daughter for the practical realities of that kind of life, which had meant, among other things, discouraging the kinds of qualities in Edna that Alice considered impractical: her directness, her excess of honesty, her tendency to say too much when she was trying to be clear. On the 4th day of the visit, sitting in the kitchen garden in the afternoon while James played at their feet, Alice looked at her daughter and said, "I was not always right about the advice I gave you." Edna looked at her mother. "The things I told you to smooth over," Alice said. "The straightforwardness. I thought it would make things harder for you. I was trying to be useful." "I know you were," Edna said. "Your husband," Alice said, looking toward the barn where Clayton was working, "seems to like you exactly as you are." "He does," Edna said. "That is not as common as it should be," Alice said. "No," Edna agreed. "I am glad for you," Alice said quietly. "Really glad, Edna, not just that you found a good situation." Edna reached over and took her mother's hand, and Alice squeezed it once, and that was the apology and the forgiveness and the understanding all at once, conducted in the precise economy of 2 honest women. Alice left at the end of June. She hugged Clayton at the depot and told him firmly that he was to write to her if anything was ever needed, and he said he appreciated that, and she looked at him for a moment with Edna's direct gaze and said, "She wrote in a letter once that you read her first letter until the paper wore thin." She paused. "That was the moment I stopped worrying about her." Clayton looked at his mother-in-law. "I did," he said simply. Alice nodded once with the expression of a woman who has weighed something and found it satisfactory. "Good," she said. "Good man." She climbed onto the train, and Clayton and Edna stood on the platform with James between them as the train pulled away, and Edna slipped her hand into Clayton's and he held it without looking at her, both of them watching the train diminish into the distance. "She approves of you," Edna said. "I know," he said. "I am very glad." Edna turned to look at him. "Are you, truly?" "She is your mother," he said simply. "Of course I care." She pressed his hand once firmly. The autumn of 1886 brought 2 things of note. The first was that the horse breeding operation reached a point where Clayton needed additional help, and he hired a young man of 22 named Diego Reyes, who was Doller's nephew, and who had grown up working horses in New Mexico, and who proved to have a natural gift with the animals that was close to remarkable. Diego was quiet and skilled and utterly serious about horses, and he and Clayton developed a working relationship that was efficient and companionable without requiring a great deal of conversation, which suited them both. The second thing was that Edna told Clayton she was expecting their second child. She told him in the morning again in her quiet hour across the kitchen table, and this time he did not need a moment to accommodate the feeling because he knew it already, had known it for 2 weeks without saying so because he was waiting for her to say it when she was ready. "You already knew," she said, watching his face. "I suspected," he said. She tilted her head. "How? You have been sleeping longer," he said. "And you were very particular about the smell of the coffee last week. And you have been rereading the same passage in that novel 3 times without turning the page." She stared at him for a moment. "I did not notice that last one," she said. "I know," he said. "We're somewhere else." She looked at him across the table with the expression she sometimes had, the one that was not quite astonishment but was in the neighborhood of it, the expression of someone continually surprised to be known this well. "You pay very close attention," she said. "I have been paying close attention since before you arrived," he said. "It is a habit I do not intend to break." She shook her head slowly, the small smile at the corner of her mouth. "Clayton Kendrick," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, simply, directly, in the same plain, honest manner she had always spoken. "I want to say that clearly, not as a preamble to anything else. Just because it is true, and I want to make sure you know it." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, his wife with her brown hair and her brown eyes and her entirely honest face, and he said, "I love you, Edna. I have loved you since before I met you, since I read that first letter and felt something change in me that has not changed back. That first letter was nothing but a list of my supposed deficiencies," she said, as she had said before, because they both knew the answer and had come to enjoy saying it. "It was the truest thing anyone had ever written to me," he said, giving the answer that was also true and also enjoyed for the repetition of it, like a good tune played again. She reached across the table and touched his face, her hand warm and familiar on his jaw, and he turned slightly and kissed her palm. Outside, the autumn light was beginning to come in gold through the kitchen window, and the cottonwood tree was deep yellow, and the prairie stretched away in its ancient, indifferent beauty. Their second child arrived in April of 1887, a girl this time, born in the first warm days of spring with the same easy competence as her brother, and Edna named her Ruth, after a gray-tant she had liked very much, and Clayton thought it was exactly the right name. Ruth was, from her earliest days, a person of strong opinions and considerable noise about expressing them, which was different from James's quieter ways but no less interesting. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's direct eyes, and she was adored by her brother and by Diego Reyes, who brought her wildflowers from the prairie when she was barely old enough to hold them, and by Dolores, who was as close to a grandmother as either child knew given the distances involved. The ranch settled into a life that had a specific and beautiful shape to it, the daily texture of a good life built by 2 people working honestly in the same direction. Edna continued to teach. She was, by 1888, a fixture of the Dusty Creek schoolhouse in the best sense, and the school's enrollment had grown to 18 students because families who had been schooling their children at home or not at all had heard about the teacher at the Creek School and made the journey. She had particular success with the children who struggled, the ones who had been told they were slow or difficult, because she had an instinct for finding the angle from which a particular mind could access a particular idea, and she was patient in the way that comes from genuine curiosity rather than performance. She wrote to her mother regularly, and her mother wrote back, and the letters between them were warmer now and more honest than they had been when distance had required them to be careful. Alice Hadley, now Alice Pratt in her daily life though she kept the name in the signature, wrote about Gerald and the Pratt household with more candor than she had allowed herself before, And Edna received these confidences with the good sense to receive them quietly, and not to offer her opinions on Gerald Pratt's household management unless asked. In 1889, Carl Gruber, Hank's older boy, wrote a letter from Wichita where he was midway through his legal studies to say that he had been offered a position in a firm when he finished, and that he wanted Edna to know because she had been the person who showed him the door. Edna read this letter aloud at the supper table, and Clayton watched her face while she read it, and saw the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has done something that mattered. Hank, when he heard the news, rode over to tell Clayton personally and sat on the porch in the October light and said, "I do not know how to thank her." "She does not want to be thanked," Clayton said. "She wants to know that Carl does well." "He will," Hank said. "Then tell her that," Clayton said. Hank looked at him. "You know her pretty well, son." "I have had some practice," Clayton said. The winter of 1889 was the hardest they had experienced, a sustained cold that came down from the north in November and did not truly relent until March. 3 of Clayton's cattle died in a storm in January, and the barn roof needed extensive repair after a particularly heavy snow, and there were 2 weeks in February where the family was largely confined to the house by weather too severe to work in comfortably. Those 2 weeks were, in Clayton's memory, among the best of his life. They were not easy, exactly. James, who was 6 now and full of energy, was confined to a small house and was creative about entertaining himself in ways that were not always compatible with household order. Ruth, at 2, was at the age where the word no was interesting rather than instructive and required constant supervision. The house was loud and warm and slightly chaotic. But in the evenings, when both children had been settled, Edna and Clayton sat by the fire with their books and their coffee and talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who have run out of small talk and arrived at the larger and more interesting conversations that live beneath it. She told him things about her childhood she had not told him before, about the particular loneliness of being a girl who read too much and said too much in a place that did not quite know what to do with her, about the years of trying to be smaller and less, and the way it had felt to finally stop trying. He told her about the year his father died, about the grief of it that was complicated by the fact that he had not entirely forgiven his father for the years of the cattle running, about the long months of working the ranch alone and slowly coming to peace with both the land and the man who had left it to him. He was not a bad man, Clayton said. He made bad choices. They are not the same thing. No, Edna agreed, they are not. He would have liked you enormously, Clayton said. You would have frightened him a little and he would have liked that, she laughed. Would I have frightened him? He was not entirely comfortable with women who said what they meant, Clayton said. He admired it, but it made him uneasy. Most men are not entirely comfortable with it, Edna said. I am, Clayton said. I know, she said. That is why I married you. In the spring of 1890, something happened that changed the shape of things for a while, and then ultimately settled them into a better shape than they had been before. Dolores Reyes came to Edna in April and told her that she was thinking of closing the restaurant. Her hands were troubling her, the arthritis that had been building for 2 years now making the long days of cooking difficult, and she was 53 years old and tired in a way that rest did not entirely fix, and her nephew Diego had a girl in town he was going to marry, and they would need a place to live. Edna sat with Dolores in the restaurant after closing time and listened to all of this, and then asked what Dolores wanted to do, not what she thought she ought to do or what made practical sense, but what she actually wanted. Dolores was quiet for a long moment. I want to not be alone, she said, with the simplicity of someone who has decided honesty is the only remaining option. I have been alone for 4 years and I am tired of it. Diego will have his own life. I do not want to be in anyone's way. Edna was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully. What if you were not in anyone's way, she said. What if you were needed? Dolores looked at her. I need someone at the house with the children on the days I teach, Edna said. Mrs. Farber has been managing it, but she has her own household, and it is a considerable imposition on her, though she would never say so. I need someone who actually wants to be there. And I happen to know 2 children who think Dolores Reyes is one of the best people on earth. Dolores looked at her for a long moment. I am not a housekeeper, Dolores said. I am not offering you a housekeeping position, Edna said. I am asking you to live with us as part of the family and to be present when I am at the school. That is entirely different. Edna Kendrick, Dolores said. Yes, Edna said. You are something else, Dolores said, which was almost exactly what Karl Gruber had said to his father 7 years earlier. I have been told that, Edna said pleasantly. Dolores moved into the room on the east side of the Kendrick house in May of 1890, and the household, which had been good before, became something richer and fuller and more alive. The children were openly delighted, and Diego came by on his days off from the ranch with his girl, a cheerful young woman named Maria who was studying to be a midwife. And the house on the Kansas plain that had once been one silent man and 140 acres of sky was now, on a good Sunday afternoon, full of children and conversation, and the smell of Dolores cooking, and the sound of Edna's voice and Maria's laughter, and Clayton sitting on the porch with Diego talking horses in a comfortable mixture of English and Spanish that neither of them thought about much. Hank Gruber came by on those Sundays fairly often as well. He was not young anymore, Hank, somewhere past 60 now and slowing slightly, and he had the look of a man who had spent too many years alone in a wide house. But in the company of the Kendrick household he was a different version of himself, louder and warmer, and more inclined to tell the stories he would not have told alone. One Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1890, Hank was sitting on the porch with Clayton and a cup of coffee, watching James, now 7, teach his sister Ruth, who was 3, the proper way to feed an apple to a horse at the corral fence, his small face enormously serious in the instruction and hers enormously serious in the attempt. I want to tell you something, Hank said. All right, Clayton said. When you put that advertisement in the paper, Hank said, I thought you were being foolish. I know you did, Clayton said. I thought it was a desperate act, Hank said. A man who could not find his own wife in his own territory. I know, Clayton said. I was wrong, Hank said. And I want to say that plainly because I think I gave you a harder time about it than was warranted. Clayton was quiet for a moment. You also told me to send for her or stop writing to her, he said. That was the most useful thing anyone said to me that year. Hank huffed, which was approximately a laugh from him. Sometimes I am useful. More than sometimes, Clayton said. Inside the house, through the open window, they could hear Edna and Dolores in the kitchen, the sound of their conversation and Dolores' low laugh at something Edna had said. She wrote to you first, Hank said. She took the first step. She answered an advertisement, Clayton said. She chose to be honest in it, Hank said. She could have written what all the others wrote. She wrote the truth instead. That is not a small thing. No, Clayton said. It is not. He thought about the letter. He still had it. It was in his desk drawer, softer than fabric now at the folds, the ink still dark but the paper worn fine from years of being opened and read. He had not stopped reading it, not entirely. Not even now, not even after 8 years of knowing her, of living beside her, of building something together on this wide Kansas plain. He still read it sometimes, when she was asleep and the house was quiet and he was at his desk with the lamp. And it still moved something in him, the directness of it, the honesty of it, the quiet courage of a woman who had decided she would rather be refused on the basis of the truth than accepted on the basis of a lie. He had kept it carefully. He had pressed it between the pages of the ranch ledger during the flood year to protect it from the damp. He had wrapped it in cloth during the hard winter when the cold was fierce enough to affect the dry goods in the cellar. It was a piece of paper that had come to mean something to him beyond its content, the object itself carrying the weight of everything that had come from it. The life they had built, the children, the house with morning light in the southeast room, the marigolds along the south wall, the evenings by the fire, the stars over the Kansas plain. He was pulled from this thought by James's voice at the fence, calling back to him. "Papa, Ruth got apple on her face and she says it was the horse, but I saw it." Clayton looked up. Ruth at the corral fence was wearing a very innocent expression that was not fooling anyone. "Ruth," he called back. "The horse did it," Ruth said firmly. "The horse did not do it," James said. "Ruth," Edna's voice came from the kitchen window, calm and unimpressed. "I can see you from here." There was a long pause. "I ate some of the apple," Ruth admitted without apparent guilt. Clayton looked at Hank. Hank was laughing so hard his coffee was in danger. The years ran forward as years do. James grew up with his mother's precision and his father's patience, and at 16, he was already a better rider than most grown men in the county, and had an understanding of horse breeding that had gone beyond what Clayton had taught him into something he had arrived at himself through reading and observation. He was a quiet young man, serious in his work, but in the evenings he had his mother's ease with language, and the family's dinner table was a lively thing. Ruth grew up loud and funny and certain of herself in a way that sometimes alarmed visitors and consistently delighted her parents, and she and Edna had a relationship of enormous mutual respect and frequent spirited disagreement that Clayton watched from a position of deep affection and some amusement. Ruth, at 12, had decided she was going to be a doctor. At 14, she had not changed her mind. Edna had not told her it was impossible, which most people would have said, because Edna had not told her daughter that honest ambition was an impractical quality in a woman, and she never would. By 1895, the Kendrick Ranch was one of the better operations in the county. Not the largest and not the wealthiest, but the one with the best horses and the most consistent good reputation. And Clayton had been asked to sit on the county agricultural board, which he did because Edna told him he should, and because she was generally right about things. Dolores Reyes, who was now in her late 50s and had become so woven into the fabric of the Kendrick household that neither Clayton nor Edna could properly remember the days before she was there, was having a better time of the arthritis, partly because Maria, Diego's wife, who had completed her midwifery training, and added to it a considerable knowledge of herbal remedies and practical medicine, had found a treatment of warm baths and specific exercises that helped enormously. Diego and Maria had 2 children of their own by now, small ones who spent a great deal of time at the Kendrick house, and who were more or less raised alongside James and Ruth as a kind of extended family, assembled not by blood but by proximity and affection. On a September evening in 1895, the evening of Clayton and Edna's 13th wedding anniversary, after the children were in bed and Dolores had retired to her room, and the house was quiet, Clayton went to his desk and took the letter from the drawer where it had lived all these years and brought it to the fireside where Edna was sitting with her book. He sat down beside her and held out the letter. She looked at it for a moment. She knew what it was, of course. She had known for years that he kept it, that he read it. She had written about it to her mother. She had never asked him about it directly because she had understood, without needing to be told, that it was something he needed to keep in the way that people need to keep the things that changed them, the objects that mark the before and after of a life. She took it from him carefully and opened it along the worn folds. She read her own careful handwriting, the young woman's handwriting, the writing of the 24-year-old who had sat at a table in Hayes City with a piece of paper, and decided to tell the truth because she could not think of any good reason not to. "I'm not remarkable in any especial way." She read the whole letter quietly in the firelight, and Clayton sat beside her and did not say anything. When she finished, she refolded it along the same worn folds and held it in her lap. "She was wrong," Edna said after a moment. "Who was?" Clayton asked, though he thought he knew. "The woman who wrote this," Edna said. "She was wrong about herself." "I know," Clayton said. "I knew it when I first read it." Edna looked at him. "No, you did not," she said, but gently. "You knew something was not right about the sentence. You did not know yet what was wrong with it." "Fair," he said. "She was wrong," Edna said again, looking at the letter. Not because she was secretly beautiful or secretly gifted or secretly exceptional in any obvious way. She was wrong because she had confused ordinary with unremarkable, and they are not the same thing at all. Clayton looked at her. Ordinary is a description of surface, she said. Unremarkable is a verdict, and she had no business pronouncing verdicts on herself based on other people's measures. No, Clayton agreed. She did not. Edna set the letter on the low table beside her and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked up at him. This man she had been learning and loving and living beside for 13 years. This man who had read her plain, honest letter until the paper wore thin and had come to the depot with his good shirt and his open face and had carried her books without being asked. I am glad she wrote it anyway, Edna said. Even being wrong, I am glad. So am I, Clayton said. Every single day. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they sat in the firelight of their house on the Kansas plain, listening to the wind move across the prairie outside. And the letter was on the table between the lamp and the coffee cups, worn soft as cloth, still keeping its place. In the spring of 1896, James turned 13, and Edna organized a birthday supper of such ambition and warmth that Dolers, who considered herself the authority on large meals, declared it the finest table she had sat at in 20 years. Hank Gruber was there, older and slower now but still himself, and Diego and Maria and their children and Mrs. Farber, who was well into her 70s and as sharp as she had always been, and Carl Gruber, who had ridden in from Wichita for the occasion, and who was now a practicing attorney, and had the same look of someone who had been given a door, and had walked through it so far he was in a different building entirely. Clayton looked around the table at all of it, the people, the food, the lamplight, the noise of children and the conversation of friends, and Edna at the head of the table talking to Carl about the law with the focused attention she gave to everything, and Ruth beside her mother loudly disagreeing with something Carl had said and being correct about it, and James helping the smaller children with their plates with his quiet competence, and Dolers in her chair at the end laughing at something Hank had said. He thought about the advertisement he had placed in the Dodge City Register in the winter of 1881, a plain, simple advertisement that had asked for a wife and helpmate, and about the 4 letters he had received and nearly thrown in the wood stove, and about the 1 letter he had opened and reread until the paper wore thin, and about the woman at the depot with her traveling bag and her stack of books and her direct brown gaze. He thought, she told me she was unremarkable in every way. He thought she was wrong about every word of that sentence. He thought, I am the luckiest man in the state of Kansas and possibly beyond. After supper, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed and Dolers had retired, and the house was quiet with the particular comfortable quiet of a house that has just been full of people, Edna came and stood beside Clayton at the kitchen window, the way they had stood at the corral fence in the early days, and they looked out together at the night prairie under a sky full of stars. Good evening, Edna said, using the phrase she sometimes used when the day had been so full that simply acknowledging it together felt like the right thing to do. Good evening, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Those stars, she said. They come out every clear night, he said, as he had said on that first day he had brought her to the ranch. She tilted her head to look up at him, a small smile. I know, she said. I have been watching them for 13 years. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. I know you have, he said. Outside, the Kansas plain stretched away under the stars in every direction, the same prairie that had been there before either of them and would be there after, ancient and indifferent and wild and vast. But in this square of warm lamplight and good wood and worn floorboards, in this house with morning light in the southeast room and marigolds along the south wall, in this life built by 2 people working honestly in the same direction, there was nothing indifferent at all. There was only this, and this was everything. The letter still lived in the desk drawer, softer than cloth at the folds, the most worn and most read and most kept thing in the house, more kept than the ranch ledger or the deed to the land or the family Bible where births and deaths and marriages were recorded in their careful line. It had outlasted the floods and the hard winters and the years of slow accumulation that build a life. It was a piece of paper with careful ink on it, written by a young woman who had decided to tell the truth, and it was as close to a beginning as any beginning has a right to be. He would read it again, Clayton Kendrick. Tomorrow morning, perhaps, or the morning after, when the house was quiet and the lamp was lit and the coffee was hot. He would open the desk drawer and take out the letter and unfold it along its worn, familiar folds. And he would read it as he had always read it, not because he did not know what it said, but because it was the truest thing he had ever been given. And some true things are worth reading again and again, as many times as the paper will hold. Outside, the stars went on, bright and numerous and close, exactly as he had described them to her in a letter so many years ago. The stars over the Kansas plain that looked so close a person felt both very small and very much a part of something enormous at the same time. Both things at once, all of it at once, everything.